There are places in the universe where fear isn't a reaction. It's a requirement for survival, and this world was one of them. The sky above churned in a dull copper haze, pressure readings spiking past safe limits as the wind carried fine metallic dust that scraped against exposed surfaces like sandpaper at 60 miles per hour. And every step across the fractured terrain triggered subtle vibrations underfoot as if the ground itself was listening. Ethan Cole stood at the edge of the landing platform, boots planted, posture relaxed, his breathing slow and measured despite the suit diagnostics flashing warnings across his visor. External temperature 214 degrees Fahrenheit, atmospheric toxicity rising, visibility dropping below 20 feet. Behind him, the diplomatic vessel hummed with controlled precision, its systems calibrated to perfection, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. And inside that order stood Advisor Valeria Threx, her tall blue-skinned form framed by clean white lighting and polished alloy walls, her golden eyes scanning a data slate filled with human personnel records. Non-augmented, no enhancements, no genetic reinforcement, she said flatly, her voice smooth but edged with quiet dismissal as she glanced toward the exterior feed, showing Ethan unmoving in the storm. Explain why this individual was assigned to my security detail. And no one answered quickly enough. Ethan didn't shift, didn't flinch, not even when a sudden gust rattled the platform. Hard enough to trigger stabilizers, because to him, the noise, the heat, the pressure, it was all familiar, almost distant, like an echo of something older. Inside, Valeria exhaled slowly, unimpressed. Remove him, she ordered, already turning away as if the matter required no further thought. I will not rely on unpredictability. And yet the feed caught something she hadn't intended to notice. While trained officers inside adjusted their stance when the ship vibrated, Ethan didn't move at all, not even a fraction of an inch, as if the world shifting beneath him was irrelevant. A junior technician hesitated, eyes flicking between the data and the screen. Advisor, he hasn't requested relief in 36 hours, and that made her pause, just briefly, just enough for curiosity to slip through the cracks of logic. She turned back, studying the still figure beyond the storm. The way he stood, not rigid, not tense, but balanced, like someone who understood the environment instead of resisting it. And for a moment the readings on her display, temperature, pressure, toxicity, felt incomplete, as if they were describing the world but not the man inside it. Humans, she murmured under her breath, more to herself than anyone else, are inefficient. Yet her eyes didn't leave the screen this time, because something about his stillness didn't match inefficiency at all. Outside, Ethan finally blinked, slow, deliberate, his gaze lifting toward the horizon where the haze shifted unnaturally. And though the sensors hadn't flagged it yet, he already knew something was changing, something approaching, and for the first time since landing, the corner of his mouth moved, just slightly, not fear, not excitement, just recognition. The horizon shifted before the instruments caught it, a subtle distortion in the copper haze that bent the light just enough to feel wrong. And Ethan Cole exhaled slowly, his breath fogging the inside edge of his visor as his suit recalibrated for another spike in atmospheric pressure. Inside the ship, a sharp tone cut through the comm, the sensor grid finally reacting with delayed urgency as new data streamed across Advisor Valeria Threx's display. Unidentified environmental fluctuation detected, the system announced in its neutral cadence. But Valeria's eyes narrowed because fluctuations followed patterns, and this did not. She moved closer to the external feed, watching the lone human still standing beyond the safety barrier, his posture unchanged, his presence almost deliberate against the chaos. And something about that lack of reaction unsettled her more than the warning itself. Recall the guard, she ordered, her tone precise, controlled, but there was a fraction of hesitation beneath it now, a calculation she had not needed before. The comm officer complied instantly, transmitting the command across secure channels. Security detail, return to interior immediately. The message echoed through Ethan's audio feed, clear, direct, and completely ignored. He did not move, not yet, because the ground beneath his boots carried a vibration too low for standard sensors, a deep resonance that traveled upward through the reinforced plating of his suit and settled somewhere behind his ribs like a memory. 36 hours without rest had dulled nothing. If anything, it had sharpened the quiet parts, the instincts that no system could replicate. And as the wind shifted direction by just a few degrees, he tilted his head slightly, listening. Inside, Valyra watched that small movement replayed on the screen, her fingers tightening around the edge of the console as data continued to flood in, pressure gradients, thermal spikes, irregular wave patterns, none of it aligning into a coherent model. And yet the human outside behaved as if he already understood it. "Why is he not responding?" she asked, not expecting an answer but receiving one anyway from a junior analyst who had been studying the feed too closely. "Advisor. His vitals are stable, completely stable." The words hung in the air longer than they should have, because stability under these conditions was statistically improbable, nearly impossible without augmentation, and yet his record showed none. Valyra stepped closer to the glass, the storm distorting her reflection as she focused entirely on him now, no longer as an expendable variable, but as an anomaly she could not quantify, and anomalies demanded attention. Outside, the haze thickened, the metallic particles in the air catching against Ethan's armor with a steady hiss as the distant distortion grew more defined, not a shape, not yet, but a presence that pressed against the edges of perception. And still he did not reach for a weapon, did not shift into a defensive stance. He simply adjusted his footing by half an inch, aligning himself with something only he could feel. "Ethan Cole," Valyra said quietly, testing the name as if it might reveal something on its own. But names meant nothing without context, and his context was a void her systems could not fill. The calm line remained open, her voice transmitted again, sharper this time. "Return to the ship. That is an order." And this time he answered, his voice low, steady, carrying none of the urgency that filled the control room. "Negative." A single word, calm, unforced, and for the first time since his assignment, Valyra felt something she could not immediately categorize. Not fear, not confusion, but the beginning of both. As she watched the horizon fold inward and realized the human had seen it long before she had. The air changed before the visuals did. A low-pressure shift that pressed against the hull and bled through every seal as the ship's internal systems struggled to compensate. Warning tones layering over each other in rising urgency, while the external feed fractured into streaks of copper and shadow. Ethan Cole remained exactly where he stood, but his focus narrowed, not on what could be seen, but on what could be felt. The rhythm beneath the storm, a pattern hidden inside the chaos that did not belong to weather or terrain. Inside, Advisor Valyra Threx watched the data collapse into contradictions, readings spiking beyond expected thresholds then dropping just as quickly, as if the environment itself refused to be measured, and for the first time her perfectly ordered system felt incomplete. "Stabilize the sensor array," she commanded, though her voice had lost a fraction of its earlier certainty. Because the human outside was no longer just ignoring orders, he was anticipating something her instruments could not define. The comm channel remained open, his single word still echoing in her mind. Negative, not defiant, not emotional, just final. "Ethan Cole," she said again, quieter now, not as a command but as a question she did not know how to ask. And again he answered, not immediately, but with the same measured calm that seemed immune to the rising tension. "It is not random," he said, his voice cutting clean through the static. "It moves in cycles," and the room fell still, every technician pausing just long enough for the implication to settle. Valyra's eyes flicked across the data again, searching for the pattern he claimed existed, forcing logic onto chaos, and then she saw it. Not clearly, but enough. A repeating interval buried beneath the fluctuations, subtle, almost invisible, but consistent. Outside, the haze parted just enough to reveal a deeper shadow beneath it. Not a form, not yet, but a density that displaced the light around it. And Ethan adjusted his stance again, shifting his weight as if aligning with something approaching rather than retreating from it. "All personnel, prepare for immediate containment protocol," Valyra ordered, her voice regaining its edge as she adapted, because control, even partial, was better than uncertainty. But even as the crew moved to comply, her attention never left the solitary figure beyond the barrier. The vibration beneath the platform intensified, not violent, not chaotic, but deliberate, like a pulse that echoed through the ground and into the structure itself, and Ethan lowered his shoulders slightly, relaxing instead of tensing, his breathing steady as the environment closed in around him. "You are exposed," Veolyra said, her tone sharper now, almost insistent. "Return immediately." And for a moment there was only the sound of the storm, the hiss of metallic particles against reinforced alloy, the hum of systems pushing beyond design limits. And then he spoke again, softer this time, as if the words were meant more for the moment than for her. "If I move now, it reacts." And that was when the final piece fell into place. Not through data, not through calculation, but through the realization that whatever was approaching was not simply part of the environment. It was responding. Veolyra's breath slowed, her mind recalibrating around a new variable she could not ignore. The human was not enduring the world outside. He was reading it, matching it, becoming part of its rhythm in a way her species had never needed to understand. And as the shadow and the haze drew closer, bending the storm around it, she found herself doing something she had not done since this mission began. She stopped issuing orders and simply watched. The pattern settled into place like a heartbeat beneath the storm, steady, deliberate, and impossible to ignore once recognized. And Ethan Cole adjusted his breathing too. Match it. Slow inhale, slower exhale, his chest rising and falling in quiet synchronization with the unseen force pressing against the world around him. The copper haze no longer drifted randomly, but curved in subtle arcs, bending toward a center that had not yet fully revealed itself. And every particle in the air seemed to carry intention rather than motion. Inside the ship, the crew moved with controlled urgency, sealing compartments, reinforcing barriers, their actions guided by protocol that assumed the threat was external and chaotic. But Advisor Veolyra Threx no longer believed that assumption, not after watching the human outside align himself with something her systems could not define. She stepped closer to the viewport, the cool surface reflecting her own image back at her, composed, precise, yet now marked by a tension she could not entirely suppress. And her eyes tracked Ethan's movements, or rather the absence of them, because stillness in the face of rising instability was not passivity, it was choice. "Report," she demanded without looking away, and the response came quickly, layered with uncertainty. "Environmental readings are stabilizing around him. Advisor, localized, approximately a 10-foot radius." And that made no sense within any model she trusted. Stability required control, and control required authority over variables. Yet the only variable present was the human she had dismissed. Outside, the vibration beneath the platform intensified again, not sharper, not more violent, but closer, like a presence stepping into alignment with the physical world. And Ethan shifted his gaze slightly to the left, tracking something that had not yet fully emerged, his posture loose, balanced, as if he were standing on familiar ground instead of an alien surface actively resisting containment. "You said it reacts if you move," Veolyra said, her voice measured, analytical again, but carrying a new layer beneath it, something that resembled trust forming without permission. "Then why has it not reacted to you?" And this time his answer came without delay, quiet but certain. "Because I am not resisting it." The words settled into the control room with a weight that no data point could replicate. And for a moment, even the background noise seemed to dim, as if the environment itself acknowledged the truth in them. Veolyra's mind moved quickly, reconfiguring everything she understood about dominance, control, survival, because her species had evolved by imposing order onto hostile systems, bending environments to their will. But this human, this single unmodified individual, stood within that hostility and did not impose, did not challenge. He adapted. The haze parted further now, revealing a deeper gradient beneath it, a shifting density that displaced both light and sound. And though its full form remained obscured, its influence was undeniable, the storm curving around it, the pressure aligning with its presence. And Ethan remained at its edge, not confronting, not retreating, simply existing within its reach. "All stations hold," Veolyra ordered softly, overriding the previous escalation, her decision made not from protocol but from observation. because interference now might disrupt whatever fragile balance had formed. And for the first time since the mission began, she allowed uncertainty to remain without forcing it into resolution. Outside, Ethan's visor dimmed slightly as the light level shifted, his breathing unchanged, his pulse steady. And in that controlled stillness, there was something unmistakable, not dominance, not submission, but understanding. And as the unseen presence drew closer, bending the storm into quiet arcs around him, Veilira realized she was no longer watching a guard endure a hostile world. She was watching a human who had already learned how to belong to one. The distance between presence and perception collapsed into something tangible, not through sight, but through pressure, a quiet weight in the air that settled into every surface and every breath. And Ethan Cole adjusted again, not stepping back, not stepping forward, but lowering his center of gravity by a fraction, grounding himself against the shifting rhythm beneath his boots. The storm no longer felt like a storm, it felt guided, its motion curving in slow arcs that converged toward a point just beyond him. And for the first time, the shape within the haze suggested intention, not form, not something to identify, but something aware. Inside the ship, the readings stabilized further, not across the environment, only around him, a localized pocket of equilibrium that expanded and contracted in subtle pulses. And the crew fell into a quiet tension, their training telling them to act, their instincts telling them to wait. Advisor Veilira Threx stood motionless at the viewport, her earlier certainty replaced by a focused stillness that mirrored the man outside, her mind tracking variables she could not fully measure. And for the first time, she did not attempt to reduce what she saw into a model. She allowed it to exist without explanation. The radius is increasing, a technician whispered, almost afraid to disrupt the moment with sound. 15 feet now. And Veilira nodded once, slowly, because the implication was clear. Whatever was approaching was not escalating, it was aligning. Outside, Ethan's visor dimmed again as the light shifted, the copper haze thinning just enough to reveal a deeper gradient behind it, layers of motion folding inward. And he spoke without raising his voice, knowing the channel was still open. Do not deploy anything. The instruction simple, direct, and carried without urgency, as if it were a reminder rather than a command. Veilira did not question it this time, did not challenge the authority behind it. She simply echoed the order, her voice steady. All systems hold, no deployments. And the crew obeyed instantly, though their eyes remained fixed on the feed, watching the boundary between human and unknown narrow to almost nothing. The vibration beneath the platform reached a new cadence, slower now, deeper, like a resonance that no longer tested the structure but acknowledged it. And Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, just long enough to match his breath to it completely. Inhale, exhale, the rhythm sinking until there was no separation between his body and the environment around him. When he opened them again, the haze parted further, not violently, not suddenly, but with a quiet allowance, and the space directly in front of him cleared into something almost calm, the particles drifting away as if guided by an unseen current. Inside, Veilira felt the shift before she understood it, the absence of pressure where it had been moments before, the silence that replaced the constant hiss against the hull. And she leaned forward slightly, her golden eyes fixed on the impossible stillness forming around a single human figure. What is it doing? Someone asked, the question barely audible, and Ethan answered as if he had been expecting it, his voice low, steady. It is deciding. And the words settled over the room with a weight that no data could match. Veilira's breath slowed again, her thoughts aligning with a realization she could not deny. This was not a test of strength, not a confrontation to win or lose. It was an evaluation, and the human she had dismissed was not being measured by power, but by presence. Outside, Ethan did not move, did not reach, did not react. He simply remained, balanced within the calm he had not created but had learned to exist inside. And as the unseen presence drew closer still, the boundary between observer and participant faded until there was only one question left unanswered, not what it was, but what it would accept. The silence stretched longer than logic allowed, not empty, but filled with something deliberate, a pause that carried weight, and Ethan Cole did not break it. His breathing remained steady, his posture unchanged, every small adjustment already completed before it was needed, as if he had learned long ago that survival was not about reacting faster, but about reacting less. The space around him widened again, the calm expanding past 20 feet now, the storm bending away in smooth arcs that no longer scraped against his armor but flowed around it. And within that cleared space the presence finally became defined, not in shape, not in detail, but in certainty, a focal point where the pressure gathered and held, as if the world itself recognized a boundary it would not cross. Inside the ship, no one spoke. The control room suspended between observation and disbelief as their instruments struggled to interpret what their eyes could see clearly, a human standing at the center of a phenomenon that refused to touch him. Advisor Valara Threx felt the shift not in the data, but in herself, the quiet collapse of assumptions she had carried without question, because everything she understood about survival involved control, resistance, force applied in precise measure, and yet the human outside had done none of those things. Explain, she said, not as a command, but as a need she could no longer suppress. And for the first time there was no immediate response, only the faint sound of Ethan's breath through the open channel, measured, grounded, until finally he spoke, his voice lower now, as if matching the depth of the moment. On my world, the ones who panic do not last, he said, simple, direct, without emphasis. The ones who fight everything burn out. And he paused just long enough for the meaning to settle before continuing. You learn to listen first. Valyra's eyes remained fixed on him, her mind absorbing the words not as theory, but as evidence, because everything she was witnessing aligned with that single principle. Outside, the presence shifted again, not closer, not farther, but adjusting, as if testing the boundary that Ethan maintained without effort. And for a brief second the pressure increased, a subtle push that rippled through the air and touched the edges of his field, but he did not resist it, did not brace against it, he allowed it to pass. His breathing unchanged, his stance still balanced, and the pressure eased almost immediately, not retreating but settling, like a question that had been answered. Inside, a technician exhaled softly, unaware they had been holding their breath, and Valyra registered the reaction without turning, because her focus had narrowed entirely to the exchange unfolding beyond the glass. It is evaluating you, she said quietly, the conclusion forming without resistance now. And Ethan gave the slightest nod, barely visible through the distortion. Everything does, he replied, and there was no arrogance in it, no challenge, only acceptance. The calm around him deepened, the storm now fully diverted, creating a pocket of stillness that should not have existed under any known condition, and within that stillness the presence settled into alignment with him, not merging, not dominating, but existing in parallel, two systems recognizing each other without conflict. Valyra felt something unfamiliar rise in her chest, not fear, not uncertainty, but respect forming from observation rather than hierarchy. And as she watched the human she had dismissed stand unchanged within a world that demanded reaction, she understood something her data could never have shown her. He was not surviving by strength. He was surviving by knowing when strength was not required. And for the first time since the mission began, she did not see him as a variable to control, but as a constant she had failed to understand. The balance held longer than any system predicted, longer than logic allowed, and Ethan Cole did not mistake that for safety. His breathing remained slow, controlled, his focus anchored not on the presence before him, but on the space between them, the thin line where reaction could still become conflict if he allowed it. The calm field around him stabilized at nearly 30 feet now. The storm fully diverted into smooth, continuous arcs that no longer pressed against the platform, and within that quiet, the presence shifted once more, not testing, not probing, but waiting. Inside the ship, the silence had become absolute. Every console dimmed to minimal output as the crew watched without speaking, because anything louder than a whisper felt like it might disrupt whatever fragile equilibrium existed outside. Advisor Valyra Threx stood with her hands resting lightly against the edge of the console, her posture no longer rigid but attentive, her gaze fixed on the human who had become the center of something she could not command, and for the first time she did not reach for authority, She reached for understanding. "What happens next?" she asked, her voice barely above a breath. And Ethan answered without looking back, his attention never leaving the presence ahead. "That depends on me." The words carried no pride, no weight beyond their meaning, and that was what unsettled her most. Outside, the pressure shifted again, deeper now, not pushing against him, but moving through the air in a slow, deliberate wave that passed across his position and continued beyond. And Ethan responded in the only way he knew how, by doing less. His shoulders lowered further, his stance softened by a fraction, not weakness but release, an absence of resistance that allowed the wave to pass without disruption. And for a brief moment the calm expanded sharply, nearly doubling in radius as the storm pulled back even farther. Inside, a faint reading spiked across the sensors, not in threat, but in coherence, a pattern forming so clearly that even the automated systems paused before labeling it. And Veolyra saw it at the same time the data confirmed it. The environment was no longer reacting randomly. It was synchronizing. "He is matching it," a technician whispered, unable to keep the realization contained, and Veolyra nodded slowly. Because that was the only explanation left. The human was not enduring the world. He was aligning with it. So precisely that the world adjusted in return. Outside, Ethan exhaled again, longer this time, his breath steady as the unseen presence drew closer to its final boundary. The distance between them now measured not in feet but in intention, and he spoke once more, quieter than before, almost lost in the stillness. "You do not win here," he said, as if speaking to the presence itself. "You either belong or you leave." And the words settled into the air without resistance. For a moment nothing changed, the calm holding, the storm waiting at its edges, the presence unmoving. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the pressure eased, not retreating, not collapsing, but accepting, the boundary between them no longer contested. Inside the ship, Veolyra felt her breath release without realizing she had been holding it, her thoughts shifting into something she had not prepared for, because this was not a victory, not a display of dominance or superiority. It was something quieter, something far more difficult to measure. Outside, Ethan remained where he was, not stepping forward to claim the moment, not turning back to acknowledge it. He simply stood within the calm he had earned, and as the presence settled into alignment and the storm held its distance, Veolyra understood the truth in a way no report could capture. The human had not changed the world. He had changed himself enough that the world no longer needed to resist him. The stillness did not break. It evolved, stretching outward in a quiet expansion that redefined the space itself. And Ethan Cole remained at its center, not anchoring it, but existing within it, as if he had always belonged there. The presence no longer pressed against him, no longer tested or questioned. It adjusted, subtle shifts in pressure and motion aligning with his breathing until the distinction between environment and observer blurred into something shared. The storm beyond the boundary continued its motion, but it no longer reached for him. Its force redirected into smooth currents that curved away with deliberate precision. And for the first time since their arrival, the external sensors began to stabilize without resistance, their readings forming patterns that matched what the human had already understood. Inside the ship, the silence transformed into something else, not tension but recognition. The crew watching as their instruments finally caught up to what had already happened. An advisor, Veolyra Threx, stood motionless, her gaze unwavering, her thoughts no longer searching for control, but absorbing what control had never required. "The field is holding," a technician said quietly, the words almost unnecessary, and Veolyra inclined her head slightly, because holding implied effort, and there was none of that outside, only balance. She stepped closer to the glass, her reflection fading as the external clarity improved, and she saw him more clearly now, not as a distant figure but as a person, his stance relaxed, his shoulders lowered, his presence unforced, and it struck her with sudden clarity that nothing about him suggested strain, not even after hours exposed to a world that defied stability. "Ethan," she said, not as a command but as acknowledgement, and this time he responded with something new, a slight turn of his head, just enough to indicate he had heard her. Though his attention remained forward. "It is done," he said, and the simplicity of it carried more certainty than any report could have. Outside, the presence shifted one final time, not advancing, not retreating, but settling into a fixed distance, a boundary established without conflict, and the calm expanded one last fraction before stabilizing completely, a pocket of quiet carved into a world that did not offer such things freely. Inside, the systems registered the change, alarms fading into passive monitoring, indicators returning to acceptable ranges, but no one moved to celebrate or even speak, because the moment did not belong to them. Veolyra exhaled slowly, the breath leaving her with a weight she had not noticed until it was gone, and her mind traced the sequence again, not as data but as experience, the dismissal, the refusal, the stillness, and the understanding that followed. "You said everything evaluates," she said, her voice low, steady, and Ethan answered without hesitation. "Yes." And for the first time, there was something beneath the word, not emotion exactly, but recognition. Veolyra's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion but in focus, because a question had formed that no protocol could answer. "And what did it decide?" she asked, and there was a pause, brief but deliberate, before he replied, "That I was not a problem," and the weight of that answer settled deeper than she expected. Outside, nothing dramatic marked the end, no sudden change, no visible departure, only the absence of pressure where it had once been, the storm continuing its distant motion without reaching inward, and Ethan finally moved, not abruptly, not with urgency, but with the same controlled precision he had shown from the beginning, turning just enough to face the ship, his posture unchanged, his breathing steady. Inside, Veolyra watched that movement with a clarity she had not possessed before, because now she understood that the moment was not defined by what had happened, but by what had not needed to happen, and as the human she had dismissed stood within a calm that should not exist, she recognized something her species had overlooked entirely. Survival was not always about overcoming a world. Sometimes it was about becoming something the world chose not to resist. The calm did not disappear when Ethan Cole turned back toward the ship. It remained, a quiet boundary that held its shape even as he took his first step forward. And that was what made it real, not a moment, not a reaction, but a change that endured beyond his stillness. Each footstep was measured, unhurried, his boots pressing lightly against the platform as if the ground no longer needed to test him, and the storm, once relentless, now curved away in silent acknowledgement, maintaining its distance without being forced. Inside, no one moved to open the doors immediately, not out of hesitation, but out of something deeper, an unspoken understanding that what had just happened required a moment to settle, to exist without interruption. And advisor Veolyra Threx remained where she was, her gaze following him with a focus that no longer carried judgment. The external feed sharpened as he approached, the distortion fading, revealing details that had been lost in the haze, the faint wear on his armor, the steady rise and fall of his chest, the absence of strain where there should have been exhaustion, and it struck her with quiet certainty that nothing about him suggested survival through force, only through adaptation. The airlock cycled open with a controlled hiss as he reached it, pressure equalizing smoothly, systems returning to their precise, ordered state. And when he stepped inside, the boundary outside did not collapse. It remained, a pocket of stillness carved into the world they had entered. Ethan paused just beyond the threshold, removing his helmet with a deliberate motion, revealing a face unchanged, calm, grounded, as if he had simply returned from a routine watch rather than something that defied every model the ship possessed. The crew watched him in silence, their earlier tension replaced by something they did not yet have words for, and Veolyra stepped forward at last, closing the distance between them with measured steps, her posture composed but no longer distant. She studied him for a moment, not searching for weakness, not evaluating performance, but trying to understand what could not be reduced to a report. And when she spoke, her voice carried a clarity that had not been there before. "You were never outmatched," she said, not as a question but as a realization, and Ethan met her gaze without hesitation, his expression steady. "That is not how it works," he replied, and there was no correction in his tone, only quiet certainty. Veolyra held his gaze for a moment longer, absorbing the meaning behind the words, the shift from conflict to coexistence, from control to understanding. And something in her posture changed, subtle but unmistakable, the distance she had maintained from him dissolving into recognition. She inclined her head slightly, a gesture small enough to go unnoticed by most, but deliberate in its intent. And in that moment the hierarchy she had enforced no longer defined the space between them. "You will remain on my detail," she said, her voice even. But this time it carried weight earned rather than assumed, and Ethan gave a single nod, not as acceptance of authority, but as acknowledgement of alignment. Beyond the hull, the storm continued its distant motion, the calm field still holding its shape, untouched, unchanged, and Veilira allowed herself one final glance toward it, her golden eyes reflecting the impossible stillness they had witnessed. She did not try to explain it, did not reduce it to data or theory, because some things, she now understood, were not meant to be controlled or solved. As she turned back, her gaze lingered briefly on the human standing before her, and for the first time since his assignment, there was no calculation in her thoughts, only a quiet, undeniable truth. In a universe ruled by force and precision, he had chosen neither, and that choice had changed everything.